Hey again. So this video is about the criticism I have of Paulo Grady's book on relativism. So at very least a previous video with a summary of that book would be absolutely necessary if you haven't watched the whole series. And I know I may have already implied this, but seriously, one's criticism is likely to have actual weight, at least weight enough to even bother replying to, only if one has actually done the reading, or in this case, actually watches the video properly that indicates there was an entire series. I really don't know what it is with the hubris of some of us to jump into like the 6th chapter of a discussion and wonder why certain things are being spoken about or in a certain way and why other things seem to be left out as if they hadn't been spoken about in great depth in previous parts, or even ignoring how they were mentioned in that video itself if it's watched well enough. I mean, it's certainly one thing not to know that there were previous parts if nobody mentioned it, but if I'm going through the trouble of mentioning the previous videos, which I pretty much always do, and even often give full recap of each videos, then I don't know what to say about that. Either way, for some my recaps are too much, and for some other people they just completely ignore that the recap even happened, it seems. I don't know. In any case, either way, this video is not going to be a great place for you to respond to his arguments if I even bother mentioning them. It's just going to explain what actually happened in his book taken at face value. So my criticism today is about how he presents himself versus what the book actually says. In particular, how open he presents himself to ontological relativism. That is, relativism about the world, the properties or the furniture of reality, the account of the world that we have. He presents himself as very open. And I think he knows that if anyone attacks him, it would be about ontology. I say this because he kind of predicts that one might say that his principles are said to be universal, so don't they constitute an exception to ontological relativity? But he clearly answers that these principles are abstractions, codifications of a practice that we do. They aren't entities themselves. They don't have an ontological status of being universally existing in all ontologies, so no, it's not an exception. Also, by the way, they are abstracted principles, so it's not like they are written rules that we observe and then follow. No such things are written down anywhere. That doesn't exist as an entity or anything like he was saying. He's not even claiming that they are. It's just rather they articulate the nature of that practice, which was the practice of being rational in deliberation. When we are thinking about something, discussing it and judging, for example. So if you're thinking he's wrong about rationality because there aren't written rules somewhere that are then followed, well, that would be a misunderstanding about what's going on here. But more importantly, that's not what my issue is about at all. To understand my criticism, let's look at what he says about the structure of his book. Right in the very beginning of his book, he said, "So the position staked out in this book is one that denies relativism about truth, accepts a great deal of ontological relativity, and a lesser amount of logical relativity, resists radical epistemological relativity, and denies relativism about reason." So that's this kind of image that I made based on what he claimed, and I pretty much showed in almost the beginning of each of my videos. But then after going thoroughly through his book and seeing how the various areas connect, we actually end up with a very different picture. This picture. And there is no greater difference among these two pictures than how he presents himself in one as accepting a great deal of relativism in ontology, or defending it, or even argued for relativism about ontology. Matter of fact, there's really only one place, if I can recall, where he uses a qualifier of it being moderate. But for the vast majority of cases, it's just open to ontological relativity, without a distinction like moderate or limited or restricted or anything. Distinctions that he makes in other areas like logic or epistemology, but not in ontology. I mean, after having gone through the book, when we clearly look at the book, it's actually his core rationality providing at very least a minimum restraint against extreme relativism in every section. Yeah, in truth, it provides a place where it's completely denied, but that's given the precondition described in the truth video if you do want to check it out. Either way, everywhere else, it's a minimum condition anyway, not like complete universal absolutism in some places and complete relativism in other places. No, in fact, even in rationality itself, if you look at the rationality chapter, it's just a minimum core that is universal anyway. So he's actually open to relativism in all of these areas in a much greater sense than the naivety of the traditional philosophers prior to him perhaps. But there is still a minimum restriction in all of them, and it's coming from his core rationality to everywhere, and as a result, that makes him say it denies relativism, resisting radical relativism, or that it only allows relativism in a very mitigated sense, even providing a restriction, and here's the contrast, when it comes to ontology. In the ontology chapter, not wanting to be charged as holding to Promethean anti-realism and just making up whatever world we want as we go along, no restriction, but the ontological relativist wants to hold that there are certain constraints on our thinking. We don't just invent reality. The realist is saying the constraint comes from the outside, as in reality, that reality constrains the theory of the world that we have, at least to some degree. But the ontological relativist, for them, the discipline is an internal issue, not something imposed from the outside. Discipline and thought comes from proper methodology, from something such as a theory of rational constraint, which is universal. And that's his core figuring out here that he offers, in a way through epistemology. In any case, it's pretty clear that there are restraints on ontology. Certainly a variety we are ruling out then is one that is the Promethean anti-realism, where we have no restraint on our account of the world and we can just make up as we go along. Someone might say though that that is the reason, because the restriction is internal and not from a mind-independent reality. That's why it's okay to just call it ontological relativity and not mention any kind of qualifiers like limited or moderate or mitigated or anything else. But let's be clear about a few things first. Firstly, there can be different levels of relativism within ontology, even if the extreme one already has a name of Promethean anti-realism. An example could be how we contrast the Straussian limitation of cognitive capacities that we have with Quine's seeming fluidity, or even actually contrasting the fluidity of Quine with his later preference for a certain ontology, i.e. physics. That was, after all, one of the tensions O'Grady points out in Quine's work. So while they are of different strengths, they were all nevertheless internal restraints. So a different degree of internal restraint does exist. I mean, I think it's pretty clear if we are taking the ontological relativists at their word and sourcing or maybe outsourcing the restraint to epistemology, then there seems to be a limitation depending on how much limitation there is in epistemology. And there is certainly a limitation in epistemology, according to O'Grady there, of different degrees of how much relativism we could have in epistemology that we would select. So why not by that nature say there are different degrees of limitation in ontology as well? Certainly it wasn't complete relativism in epistemology. There was a minimum restraint. That's why we called it moderate. So then that should be worth noting that it means there is a restraint in ontology as well. It's precisely the reason why we mentioned it in truth and in logic and even in epistemology where the restraint came from rationality. That restraints do come in different strengths and are coming from another area still implies that this area is restrained to different degrees, and that was a good enough reason to still call it restraint against extreme relativism in other places like epistemology, but he didn't do that for ontology. Okay, so let's ask, what does it mean to say that there is restraint if we did say it? Well, 1. For O'Grady it is possible that we may sometimes hold two sets of ontology in tandem. 2. O'Grady is open to the idea that worldviews can contradict. After all, in the rationality chapter, when in discussion of how there can be different empirically adequate metaphysical systems, he says, insofar as they, and he means Chi or the Hopi metaphysical systems that he called absolutely developed worldviews, but anyway, insofar as they are empirically adequate, they do not contradict empirical evidence. However, they do cut against the materialistic or physicalistic metaphysics. There is therefore an argument possible between two metaphysical systems. So 1, we can have two ontologies, 2, they can contradict. But also, 3, one of them may be considered false. They may be false. So we can resolve this contradiction by considering one false. So yeah, maybe it's not because of any metaphysical commitment to reality, but because of our rational constraint that impacts what commitments we have to different ontologies. Certainly he appears to admit that his core or his principles does govern our different ontologies, as he says in his final chapter. Whatever theory or ontology we deploy in interpreting and understanding reality is put together under the governance of these principles. So a certain kind of practice is regarded as universal, the practice of reasoning and arguing. This doesn't conflict with ontological relativism. So here it is again that he is saying in this line that it doesn't contradict with ontological relativism because those principles aren't entities. This line is, after all, taken from that exact same section earlier that I was quoting from in the beginning, where he anticipated that kind of criticism, but at the same time, he is admitting here that our ontologies, and we can hold multiple, are governed by the principles of core rationality. But it's the same thing then as it was in logic or epistemology, for example. There is a core rationality that is governing there. And it was the basis by which we would restrict against extreme relativism, carefully saying for logic that relativism would be allowed but only in a mitigated sense, or in epistemology where it's by that restriction just moderate epistemological relativism that is allowed. So why is ontology being treated differently? I mean, it does mean something to mention that by rationality, even if not an appeal to external mind-independent reality or anything, that we do rule against having contradictory ontologies, or self-contradictory ontologies via our coherentist systems, as such valuing some, those with less contradiction, as greater than those with more contradictions, so they're not equally viable, as we examine them in our conscious deliberation, therefore not holding them as having equally valuable status. Perhaps some are more and some are less contradictory with other ontologies that we hold in tandem, or within its own subsystem. There is work being done here by rationality or the principles to limit ontologies, and such is admitted and explicated in different places. For example, in the epistemology chapter when talking about different coherentist system, how it is restricting against the proliferation of infinite number of coherentist systems that we may hold. Or in another part of epistemology, the end, where rationality being the means by which we judge different a priori frameworks, that was explicitly explained as well. So it is explicated, but not exactly in the way I just did now before. The thing is, I'm just doing a little bit of hypothetical syllogism, putting things together to show and explicate the constraint that is in ontology based on his work. I mean, it's his work that suggests that this is the case, that that's what we do with ontologies. But he doesn't spell it out for us like this. For some reason, I have to do that here. I mean, I agree with it, but it's coming from my explication here, not his, even if it is based directly on his work. So what I disagree with, and what would have become very obvious had he explicated what I just did, is how there is no distinction being given in ontology like there is in other places for limited ontological relativism or mitigated ontological relativism versus extreme or radical or stronger ontological relativism by O'Grady in the most of the cases that he presents himself. So there is enough in this book from the structure itself, what it purports to say, what is happening between these various areas and how they function together to see that what is described as happening in other areas is also happening in a similar fashion in ontology, but in ontology being described in a different way. Why? Some manipulative reason perhaps? So the second part of my criticism is this kind of trick that seems to be happening. I described it previously in the previous video how there's sort of different kind of relativists, which is in part what O'Grady is saying we don't want to be a certain kind that is self-defeating, but I suggested there's another kind which is one that doesn't know that stepping in or pulling terms to avoid self-defeat still ends up in a place where they end up preventing themselves from engagement. As I mentioned maybe in the previous video, this is what happened and this is the move that was made against Barnes and Bloor when they pulled terms using Mary Hess, I think, with their balance of argument. But you see, the thing is, when Barnes and Bloor use terms like balance of argument or empirical evidence, when they claim these things favor them and not the opposition, then they obviously do mean them in a general sense outside of their position, or else there would have been no efficacy in saying that they favored them in the first place. And if not, there might be versions of balance of argument or empirical evidence that actually weigh against them anyway, so there's no point in bringing up that theirs favor them. And that's the reason why O'Grady says it seems clear that these terms are in fact intended in a universal sense. And it's not the only place where the effective silence or lack of engagement is pointed out when you pull terms like this. It happened in truth as well. But it's being pointed out for O'Grady still is a reason to rule against relativism in such places because of the effective silence, since relativists do in fact want to engage, according to O'Grady. So this technique didn't cut it for O'Grady in other places like truth or rationality. But as I mentioned in the previous video, speaking in the ontology chapter itself, About one of the main ontological relativists discussed there, O'Grady says of Putnam, his argument against extreme relativism is simply that it is self-refuting. If one claims that each perspective is equally valid, then that very view is one among many perspectives, and it has no purchase on anyone else's position and may be safely ignored. So the technique is mentioned there, and why it doesn't work in ontology. But to this, O'Grady just says that he will refer to other chapters and come back to what epistemological or rational constraints can coexist with ontological relativism. But first and foremost, he already did speak about the discipline coming from rationality within this chapter, not really later. But anyway, more importantly, it doesn't seem to even properly connect as a response to what is said. Why isn't the self-defeat, or failure to engage rather, nevertheless still pressed in response to a relativist pulling terms in ontology like it is in other cases? And they absolutely did do that in ontology. The world, reality, ontology, properties, existence, all of it is pulled. That was one of the main things that was done there, in a way reducing ontology into epistemology. It isn't clear why the restraint that is implied is only coexistence in ontology, but restriction in others. So to make this clear about what I'm saying, just as I explained what restraint would mean if it were explained in ontology, let me explain what would have happened if he didn't allow this technique to work in ontology. Ontology is relative, is itself a specific ontological view. To say that we create our worldviews relative to our conceptual scheme is itself a worldview, and it is being said as if in a non-relative sense. It is being said as if in a general sense, that is, at least in a way that would oppose other ontologies, such as one that says, for example, our account of the world is taken directly from the properties of the world itself. That's being opposed here. To say our account of the world is exclusively relative to our internal workings, since there is no meaning in speaking of an external influence, is itself a claim about what is the case with the accounts we give. So we see this kind of counter in other areas, but it's not being utilized here by O'Grady and described as preventing extreme or radical ontological relativism. If I may use some example, we pressed self-defeat in epistemology. Each epoch judges itself. One problem for philosophers who hold this position is that in their own practice they seem to be making claims that transcend particular cultures, so it's taken as self-defeating. One way to say this is that they want to deny that there's necessarily anything shared among all of them, that one cannot judge among them, but in doing so they are speaking about all of them in some general sense as if that is something that they all have in common, and so they are judging them to be in such a way in this general sense, so they're doing what they claim shouldn't be possible. Or to defend Quine from being interpreted as using global KI. But Quine's own work itself shows that it is not global MI or KI, or else it would have undermined his own work. We saw this with Rorty and Stitch and B&B. Quine's work is describing different paradigms, as if from the outside of them. If the claim is that terms cannot be understood outside the paradigm in which they are used, then one cannot compare paradigms in the way Quine has done, or even used against MacIntyre. He says a significant challenge to universalism about rationality comes from MacIntyre, who espouses that there are different traditions of thought that embody their own criteria of rationality and no neutral ground to evaluate them. First off, the self-defeat, like we have seen many times now. A quick response is to wonder which tradition MacIntyre inhabits and how he manages to discuss and evaluate the ideas of so many people from other apparently incommensurable traditions. There are various areas where we notice the relativists are doing what they say they cannot do, in order for them to take a position on matters where they're saying you can't take a position. But it isn't being used here in ontology to catch or prevent an extreme ontological relativist in the ways that O'Grady suggests could happen in other places. So why is he doing this? Is he actually being tricked here, or making a mistake? Goofing up? Well, I'm not capable of pointing out such an error, surely. I am, after all, just a shadowy internet character, after all. But if I am right, then perhaps this was done on purpose. Perhaps he is simply allowing for such a technique to work here, and purposely portraying himself as being more open than other areas to ontological relativism. But why? Why would he do that? Why is ontological relativism getting such special treatment? Well, now, I made, if I think of it, possibly even a distasteful charge against O'Grady at the end of the ontology video, so I'm sorry that it is that way. Again, it's probably my lack of understanding, my error here. Surely it must be that. But I think O'Grady absolutely does have enough tools in his arsenal within his book to actually, and has actually, defended against ontological relativism of an extreme variety in 3 different ways. I have only presented 2 so far, and the 3rd one will come after this conclusion. But instead he is purposely portraying himself as open to relativism in ontology just to placate relativists by having an area they feel they are on good footing, a way of funneling relativists to ontology away from other areas. I'm actually prompted by him to see this as his motivation because of his insistence that this is the best way to accommodate relativists. About ontological relativism, he says at the very end of the ontological chapter, it appears to be one of the best ways those attracted to the relativistic ideas can accommodate that relativism. And near the end of the book, he says, much of what motivates people to accept relativism can be accommodated by ontological relativism. So in a way, it appears that he's actually just placating relativists by not talking about how he has actually restricted against ontological relativism in a number of ways. So, to be clear, I'm not disagreeing with him about the funneling. I agree with him that many arguments for relativism, let's say in rationality for example, are only ever really about conceptual or ontological relativity anyway when you actually analyze them. And many relativists don't seem to recognize this because they're not very clear on which relativism they're even talking about, especially when they're presenting arguments. And that's pointed out both by O'Grady and Phillips. They talk about this kind of thing, but that's another thing anyway. My issue here or claim is that while funneling into ontological relativism, he won't actually mention that even in that area it is also just moderate relativism or restricted or mitigated relativism. Instead, he portrays it as if his book is just openly accepting ontological relativism, period. Or just tentatively, because he's not ruling against one way or another. So I'm saying I think he does this on purpose to make the funneling just seem more acceptable for the relativist, more appealing to do so, in a way purposely hiding the restrictions that are in that area as well. But holding back attacks or defenses just to make victories of yours in other areas seem more acceptable to your opponents, which is a very maybe kind thing to do. I don't know about emotions, but it does seem more like a psychological trick, a manipulative technique played on the relativist than honest philosophic work. Wow, are you saying O'Grady is being dishonest somehow? That's not cool, man. Why would you say that? Look, yeah, I know. Okay, listen. I don't know how else to feel about it though. I very much love this book. It's very rich and textured. It goes through many different philosophical discussions and discusses relativism in a very impactful way. And that's why I think there's such good lessons we can take from this book, even though I think there's a lot missing too. But my issue would be that his stance ultimately leaves the work of discussing the role of reality out, and maybe we can talk about that more with Phillips. But even that is a different issue from what I'm actually criticizing here, based on his book, if we take it at face value. And really, my criticism isn't that massive in terms of his philosophy, which is largely something I agree with, even if it is excluding or leaving open the discussion of reality playing an important role in what we count as or think of as true or knowledge or facts. In comparison to that, this is really a rather small criticism perhaps of just representing oneself differently than one's work actually seems to be. So it could be an error in me, which is fine, I hope it is, but if it isn't, then it's either some kind of error in his work or purposely done. It can't strictly be an error though, because my criticism is about the way he's portraying himself, and I just find it misleading. There is enough in his work to make movements against ontological relativism despite what he says. So again, my assessment is that O'Grady presents himself as much more relativistic than he actually is based on the structure of his book, techniques of relativists that failed in other areas but seem to work here, as well as one more reason that I'm gonna cover. I would agree with him that the middle ground is what this book is, and I agree that the middle ground between the extremes is a result of a more philosophically aware path and a path of the future in philosophy. And while this book is a little more favorably open to anti-realist philosophy than my position would be, it's where he claims he lands on the middle path that does not seem to me to be where the book itself actually is saying it is. But now let's look at the most important component of my criticism. that speaks about ontology anyway, and it will lead us into a discussion about what is left out in this book. Assertion. You see, this whole book, its best case for the universal hinges on non-contradiction, and I doubt saying that is controversial at all. And now we're gonna see a little funny thing that can happen in philosophy, much like it happened to Quine with just a few lines from his work leading to radical interpretation, as we have seen in the rationality video. Well, in this case, it's a few words that O'Grady says when explaining assertion that impacts a truth deeper than he discussed. You see, the argument for the principle of non-contradiction actually goes like this. The basic problem is that the notion of contradiction is essentially connected to the notion of assertion and negation. When one makes an assertion, one first of all expresses a content, and then endorses it as true. This content holds that something in the world is in such a way. Such an assertion also rules out various other things, namely the negation of that assertion. So assertion implies the rejection of the negation of the assertion. But a contradiction makes an assertion and simultaneously asserts the negation of that first assertion. Because of this, a contradiction undermines the very process of making an assertion. To accept a contradiction means to render empty the very act of asserting. Hence, contradictions must be avoided. So the principle of non-contradiction is itself being defended in order to preserve the very act of assertion, also negation. So again, despite what I am saying next, this defense is not about esoteric objective assumptions or whatever have you assumptions about an ignorant or naive realist. That would be, after all, a derogatory description and a philosophic failure to grasp the argument that's happening here that O'Grady is offering. The defense is actually based on what it even means to say anything meaningfully, but that means it is actually the nature of assertion first that is really doing the work, and thus why we cannot have contradiction, because it would undermine the very process of assertion according to him. So let's focus on assertion, and ask again, what does assertion even mean according to O'Grady? How do we cash out this concept of assertion? So I'm going to read it again but slowly so we can really figure out what I'm trying to say here. When one makes an assertion, one first of all expresses a content and endorses it as true. Now the word true here, I'm just going to leave alone. I don't even think he needed to bring that up because it may introduce some questions that he may not have wanted at that point in time. But anyway, that's not what I'm doing. I wonder what is expresses a content. What is this content? Well, he says, this content holds that something in the world is in such a way. This line itself described that assertion as fundamentally making an ontological claim, a claim about the world. The very act of assertion is actually inherently tied into issues of ontology, to say that the world is a certain way, in such a way. That is the nature of all assertion, and it may take some philosophic reflection to realize it, that there's an implicit claim about how things are, and when we bother to say how things are, however qualified it is, there is some connection to a certain way in the general sense, as we couple this with his explication of how we cannot escape the notion of general truth. In all claims of speaking, even when you're talking about yourself, your sense, your feelings, is an attempt to state reality as being in such a way. However fallible and unjustified, this attempt to do so is a necessary component. All claims involve content that is conversationally intended to be about the world being a certain way, stating what is the case, in such a way that rules out the opposite of what one is saying. This is the philosophic eye. The recognition of what it even means to take a position, to make an assertion, to speak of anything in any field. That's why I sometimes call it metaphysical. I'm not saying the I exists as an entity somewhere ontologically. There's no magical spiritual superpowers I'm talking about here. I'm just theatrically presenting this philosophic awareness as an I for its recognition, that philosophers recognize certain necessities in order to take a position at all. And so this I would activate or just notice and recognize that one is trying to take a position that would undermine doing so. Let's look at some of that activation. No one can say anything at all. Then how did you say that? no one should be denied at all. So aren't you denying those who would deny? We can only speak about ourselves. Then how are you speaking about others now? I disagree with the idea that disagreement is possible. Then how are you disagreeing? No one can speak in the general sense. Then why is that in the general sense? No one can objectively evaluate. Then how did you make that evaluation? We should no longer take any philosophic positions. That is itself a philosophic position. Philosophy is garbage and pointless. Is itself your philosophic position. Philosophy is garbage and science is the best. That itself is philosophy of science. Talking with any authority is not possible. Then what's your authority behind saying that? Whether it's based on reason or evidence, empirical structures, logic, whatever it is, however which way we feel the need then or ability to participate in the battlefield, that becomes something that shouldn't also at the same time be at risk when we are there, at very least, by us. So do not be tricked by the extreme relativists to shoulder the burden of providing something impossible, an objective language, or an objective observation, or absolute anything. They are powerful enough to attack anything that comes across them in a certain way, and that's the way that they're going to continue to emphasize and always see. And so they will claim that everything is relative, ignoring the assumptions made in their own claim. There is a necessary assumption that something of what I bother to say when I make an assertion about how things are, whether currently or forever inexplicable or not, conveys something about reality beyond the individual speaking and taking a stance in order to engage. That even if a proposition is completely relative, in that the proposition is relative to many factors, sure, but there is an assumption that one of those things that it is relative to is a shared reality as a medium to whomever I am speaking with. That there is something of my assertion that has to do with how the world is in a certain way, beyond that which is created by my mind alone, and thus ruling out the opposite way at the same time. This section of this video, the Philosophic EYE, I would like you to couple with my video, the My Move video, which is a part of the Kirk series, so you may have to watch the Kirk series to really appreciate it. But if you connect the My Move video from that series with this part of this video, I would really appreciate it. Please maybe rewatch that one or check it out or something. But you will see how there is a deep socially ethical aspect of this as well. And there's certainly these kind of social and ethical aspects which O'Grady doesn't do too much a discussion of, but we'll get to next. But as a preview, the more powerful relativists often discussed here in O'Grady's version use philosophies to talk about how things are relative to a society, to a community. But in such a view, the existence of a society or the community is implicit in such a philosophy, and so it is not in question. And in a way that definitely would contradict the individualist-based extreme relativist, even though they don't really account for that. I've encountered some people who would immediately agree with, as I say, any kind of relativism, so they would immediately agree with extreme individualistic-based relativism, even though that relativism may be in contradiction with community-based relativisms, which are the more powerful varieties, seemingly, ones that are based on actual philosophers' writings and history and so on. Anyway, the move to more powerful relativism then definitely makes it even more favorable, the kind of point I was making there, that it will connect important ways to the point I made about the conversational standards of behaving as if committed to a metaphysical reality of another's existence and the independent agency of others outside of you and your own personal perception. Now, of course, relativists may say, oh, okay, so it's just a necessary assumption for conversations. So what? That doesn't really mean there is a mind-independent reality, let alone any argument for the ability for our language to convey non-relative reality. So really, reality is still relative. Well, welcome back, relativists, to the realist world, where conversational standards don't hold light against our concern for what really is the case. That's actually a deep cut if you get what was done in ontology. So I hope you get the joke because, they were trying to pull terms in an important way and try to make things more about the conversational standards rather than a discussion of metaphysical reality beyond them. But that move really didn't help him. And that's part of basically the reason why I think this book is so good, because it connected the principle of non-contradiction to the nature of assertion, the nature of communicating with others, rather than what is typically assumed, metaphysical commitments, philosophers, traditional stuff. Anyway, it's still rather important to note that many of the elements aren't made by O'Grady or myself. They have been around for a while. As I mentioned, self-defeat and incoherence of certain forms of relativism have been known for thousands of years, even to many well-known relativists themselves. And even this connection of the defense based on assertion rather than a transcendental structure building, you could actually see in the positivist's writing, which O'Grady was probably heavily influenced by, given he wrote a whole book about him. But it's how O'Grady wrote it and put it all together in the various fields that I really liked. And yet, for maybe that exact same reason of the positivist influence, he didn't really draw out or address the ontological implications, and so that may be the tension of his own work for claiming to be open to ontological relativism a great deal. Let me give you some of my closing remarks now. There are more criticisms I could have of O'Grady, of course, and I do have, but those are mainly about what is left out, and that being a discussion at least of Wittgenstein in a more general sense that was mostly absent, if not soft, in this book. This book was more kind of Quine heavy, and ironically I think it could have explicated a more middle ground or a more nuanced position if we could have actually taken a closer look at Wittgenstein. It really does highlight the difference between someone who thinks Wittgenstein's philosophy leads to some radical relativism and someone who understands how that isn't so at all, as Patrick Phillips may say, does violence to the spirit of Wittgenstein. Phillips specifically looks closely at Wittgenstein and uproots misinterpretations of him from relativistic thinkers. But hey, O'Grady said he was on the one hand trying to be general and cover a more broad range of things in a more surfaced way, even though this is definitely far too textured for somebody new to philosophy. Anyway, it's still rather clear that if we were trying to give a full treatment of relativism everywhere, then this book would be way freaking massive, so I'm glad it's not. Anyway, so that's my criticism and the explanation of the power that I promised you. You may agree with O'Grady or disagree in ways that I have about what is necessary in order to take a position at all. But the power is at very least to recognize that there is something necessary and therefore not relative in order to take a position at all, or at least is necessary for those who are in combat or in conversation or sharing among each other in a shared way. And your philosophic eye will hopefully now activate whenever you hear someone or some other warrior saying or doing something on the basis of what they are attacking. So we're going to Phillips next, and I have spoken a lot about him already, without perfect citations, so forgive me for that. I'll get to it when I do cover him. But when we do get to it, we are going to be forced into talking about some politics, and there's some politically related stuff in this philosophy. But please understand that a far more nuanced understanding elevates a conversation philosophically from kind of typical tribalistic political talk. It's definitely more complicated than the reductive simplicity that would aid tribalism a lot. In any case, I will be clear about what I'm saying later if it hasn't already been made to some of us. I know there are a number of places where I've given clues. Join us, good warrior, for we travel now to see the insights of Patrick J.J. Phillips. Then finally, after all this time, return to the battlefield of philosophy of science, and explain how these science wars are impacting the world to this very day. Oh, and I'm sorry I never actually properly covered Davidson. Davidson versus O'Grady is something that I said I would do and something that O'Grady talked about in this book, and so I never really covered it. I'm actually very attracted to some of Davidson's arguments, so maybe one day I can cover specifically O'Grady versus Davidson after I take a closer look at Davidson directly instead of just relying on what O'Grady says. Because right now I can't recall from Davidson what O'Grady says and what he was referring to. But there's also so much I promised to do. Anyway. Remember, philosophers keep battling.